The sound of expensive heels clicking against worn linoleum echoed through Mama's kitchen like gunshots in a cathedral. Marcus Washington looked up from wiping down table 6 to see a well-dressed white woman in a pearl necklace pointing a manicured finger directly at 2 shivering children huddled by the window, rainwater still dripping from their threadbare clothes onto his freshly mopped floor. "I'm not paying good money to eat next to street trash," the woman declared loud enough for every patron in the small Alabama diner to hear. "Either you move those filthy beggars, or we're leaving and taking our money with us." The afternoon thunderstorm had driven everyone indoors, including these 2 kids who couldn't have been older than 10 and 12. Marcus had watched them slip through the door 5 minutes ago, their hollow eyes scanning the room like frightened animals seeking shelter. The boy's shoes had holes that revealed pale socks, and the girl clutched a torn teddy bear like it was her lifeline. They hadn't asked for anything, just stood there, trying to become invisible. Mrs. Henderson, the woman with the pearls, tapped her foot impatiently while her husband nodded in agreement. Their teenage son smirked from behind his phone, clearly entertained by the spectacle. At the counter, other customers had stopped eating to watch the drama unfold. Marcus felt their collective gaze burning into his back as he stood frozen between 2 worlds. The world where he needed this job to pay rent, and the world where 2 children needed someone to see them as human beings. "You heard the lady," called out Jake Morrison, the day manager, from behind the register. His voice carried the lazy authority of someone who'd never had to choose between doing right and keeping a roof over his head. "Handle it, Marcus. This is a family establishment." Marcus's weathered hands tightened around the cleaning rag. At 52, he'd worked every menial job Alabama had to offer, from cotton fields to construction sites to this greasy spoon that barely paid minimum wage. His knees ached from standing all day, his back protested every time he bent to clear a table, and his pride had been chipped away bit by bit, year after year. But somehow, looking at those 2 kids, something deep inside him that he thought had died long ago began to stir. "Come on, children," he said softly, approaching them with the same gentle movements he'd once used with his own daughter before cancer took her away. "Let's find you a better spot." The girl looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much for someone so young. Her brother stepped protectively in front of her, ready to run or fight despite being outweighed by everyone in the room. Marcus knelt down to their level, his voice barely above a whisper. "What are your names?" "Sarah," the girl whispered. "This is Tommy." "Well, Sarah and Tommy, I'm Marcus, and I think you 2 look hungry enough to eat a horse." He glanced toward the kitchen, calculating how much his next paycheck could absorb. "How about I set you up at my favorite table, right there in the corner where it's nice and quiet?" "Mrs. Henderson's voice cut through the air like a whip. "I said get them out, not relocate them. Do you people not understand English?" The words, "you people," hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Marcus felt every eye in the restaurant turn toward him, waiting to see if he'd bow his head and shuffle these children back into the storm, or if he'd finally pushed his luck too far in a town where pushing back had consequences. He thought about his tiny apartment with the leaking roof, about the electricity bill sitting unopened on his kitchen table, about how many doors had already been slammed in his face when he'd tried to find better work, about his daughter Marie, who'd dreamed of becoming a doctor before leukemia stole her future at age 16. She'd made him promise on her deathbed to always help kids who had nobody else. "Ma'am," Marcus said, straightening to his full height, "these children aren't bothering anyone. They're just trying to get out of the rain." "They're bothering me," Mrs. Henderson snapped, "and we're paying customers. So are they once I take their order." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the coffee maker seemed to hold its breath. Tommy's small hand found Marcus's, trembling but trusting. Sarah clutched her teddy bear tighter. Jake Morrison's face turned red as a boiled crawfish. "Marcus, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "My job," Marcus replied calmly. "Taking care of customers." "Those aren't customers, they're charity cases, and this isn't a soup kitchen." Mrs. Henderson stood up so fast her chair scraped against the floor. "I've never been so insulted in my life. Harold, we're leaving, and I'm calling the health department about this place." As the Henderson family stormed out, Marcus guided the children to the corner booth. His hands shook slightly as he poured them each a glass of water, knowing that every step he took was one step closer to unemployment. But Sarah's grateful smile and Tommy's whispered, "Thank you," made something inside his chest feel lighter than it had in years. "What would you like to eat?" he asked. "We don't have any money," Tommy admitted, his cheeks burning with shame. "Did I ask if you had money?" Marcus winked. "I asked what you'd like to eat." 20 minutes later, Marcus set down 2 plates loaded with fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and cornbread. He'd used his employee discount and dipped into his tip jar to cover the cost, but watching these kids eat like they hadn't seen food in days made every dollar worth it. "Marcus!" Jake's voice boomed across the restaurant. "Get over here!" "Now," Marcus squeezed Sarah's shoulder gently. "You two take your time eating. Nobody's rushing you." He walked to the counter where Jake stood with his arms crossed and his face twisted into a scowl. Around them, the remaining customers pretended to focus on their food while clearly eavesdropping on every word. "You're fired," Jake said without preamble. "Clear out your locker and get out." "For feeding hungry children? For driving away paying customers and making executive decisions about my inventory without permission?" Jake's voice grew louder, ensuring everyone could hear. "You think because you've been here 6 months you can run the place? I've got news for you. Waiters are a dime a dozen in this town." Marcus felt the familiar weight of defeat settling on his shoulders. In 6 months, he'd managed to catch up on most of his bills. Now he'd be back to choosing between electricity and groceries. But when he looked over at the corner booth where Sarah and Tommy were sharing bites of cornbread and actually giggling, the first happy sound he'd heard from them, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choice. "Those kids needed help," he said quietly. "Then let their own people help them," Jake sneered. "Not my problem, and not yours anymore." The laughter from the corner booth stopped. Other customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few looked ashamed, though not ashamed enough to speak up. Marcus untied his apron and laid it on the counter. "Finish your food," he called out to Sarah and Tommy. "You've got plenty of time." As he walked toward the door, he heard Jake's voice behind him. "And don't bother using this place as a reference. Nobody wants to hire a troublemaker." The laughter that followed him out into the rain sounded like a pack of hyenas. 20 years passed like pages turning in a book Marcus couldn't put down, each chapter more difficult than the last. He'd found work where he could, washing dishes at a truck stop, cleaning office buildings at night, stocking shelves at a grocery store where the manager looked the other way when he took home expired food. His apartment got smaller and smaller with each move, until he ended up in a studio above a laundromat where the smell of detergent had permanently embedded itself in his clothes. At 72, his arthritis made every movement a negotiation with pain. His back had curved into a permanent question mark from decades of physical labor. The mirror showed him a man who looked older than Moses, with gray stubble and eyes that had seen too much disappointment. But somehow, he'd never lost the habit of helping people who needed it, slipping a few dollars to a homeless veteran, helping an elderly neighbor with groceries, volunteering at the church food bank on Sundays. He'd never married after Marie's mother left when the medical bills got too high. Never had other children. The closest thing to family he had was Mrs. Rodriguez next door, who sometimes brought him plates of rice and beans when she cooked too much. On this particular Tuesday morning, Marcus was mopping the floors at Chuck's Chicken Shack, another greasy spoon in another part of town where the linoleum was just as cracked and the customers just as demanding. His supervisor, a 20-something kid named Brandon, barely looked up from his phone when Marcus clocked in. The breakfast rush had been slow, giving Marcus time to clean thoroughly while his joints still allowed it. He was wringing out the mop when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong in their quiet neighborhood, a rhythmic thumping that grew louder and louder until the entire building seemed to vibrate. Other customers pressed their faces to the windows, pointing up at the sky. "What the hell is that?" Brandon muttered, finally putting down his phone. Marcus looked up to see a black helicopter with official government markings circling overhead before beginning its descent toward the small parking lot behind the restaurant. The downdraft from its rotors scattered trash and bent the scraggly trees that grew through cracks in the asphalt. "Probably drug bust," someone called out. "Bet they're looking for that dealer who hangs out behind the liquor store." But Marcus felt something strange in his chest, a flutter of recognition he couldn't quite place. The helicopter touched down with surprising gentleness, and for a moment everything was still except for the gradually slowing rotors. The door opened and 2 figures stepped out. The first was a man in a crisp military uniform, his bearing unmistakably that of someone accustomed to command. Even from a distance, Marcus could see the silver eagles on his shoulders that marked him as a colonel. Behind him came a woman in an expensive-looking business suit, her posture confident and purposeful. They walked straight toward the restaurant. Brandon scrambled to unlock the front door, his earlier bravado evaporating in the face of whatever official business was about to walk through it. The other customers fell silent, some reaching for their phones to record whatever was about to happen. The colonel entered first, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Marcus, who stood frozen with the mop still in his hands. The woman followed, and as she stepped into the fluorescent light, Marcus felt the world tilt on its axis. Those eyes. He knew those eyes. "Marcus Washington?" the colonel asked, his voice strong but somehow familiar. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. The woman stepped forward, and when she smiled, Marcus saw the ghost of a little girl clutching a torn teddy bear. "Hello, Marcus. It's Sarah, and this is Tommy." The mop clattered to the floor. Marcus stared at them, his mind struggling to process the impossible. The frightened children from that rainy afternoon had become these accomplished adults, a military officer whose chest displayed ribbons Marcus didn't recognize, but knew must represent significant achievements, and a woman whose confident bearing and expensive clothes spoke of success beyond anything that small Alabama town could have imagined. "You remember us," Sarah said, and her voice carried the same gentleness it had 20 years ago, though now tempered with the authority of someone used to being heard. "I remember," Marcus whispered. Tommy, Colonel Tommy now, stepped forward. "We've been looking for you for a very long time, Marcus. We had some debts to pay." The restaurant had gone completely silent. Even Brandon stood slack-jawed, his phone forgotten in his hand. Marcus felt his legs wobble, and Sarah immediately moved to steady him, guiding him to the nearest chair with the same careful attention he'd once shown to two hungry children. "I don't understand," Marcus managed. Sarah reached into her briefcase and pulled out a folder thick with official-looking documents. "After you helped us that day, social services found us. We were placed in a foster home with a family who believed education could change everything. Tommy earned a full scholarship to West Point. I went to Harvard Law School." "She's being modest," Tommy added with a grin that made him look exactly like the boy Marcus remembered. "She's now the deputy White House counsel. I command a battalion at Fort Bragg." Marcus shook his head in wonder. "But how did you find me?" "We never stopped looking," Sarah said. "It took us years, but we finally tracked down Jake Morrison, your old manager. He wasn't very cooperative at first, but Tommy can be quite persuasive when he wants to be." Tommy's smile turned slightly predatory. "Amazing how helpful people become when a full colonel shows up asking questions." Sarah opened the folder and pulled out a document with an official seal. "Marcus, by order of the President of the United States, you are hereby awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for exemplary deeds of service for your country and fellow citizens." The words didn't make sense. Marcus stared at the document, his eyes too blurred with tears to read the elegant script. "I don't understand. I just fed two hungry kids." "You did more than that," Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "You saw us when everyone else looked away. You risked your job, your livelihood, to make sure we were safe and fed. You taught us that kindness isn't about what you can afford to give, it's about what you can't afford not to give." Sarah knelt beside Marcus's chair, taking his weathered hands in hers. "Every achievement we've made, every life we've saved, every bit of good we've done in this world, it all started with your decision to see us as worthy of basic human dignity. Do you have any idea how many people we've been able to help because you helped us first?" Marcus looked around the restaurant, seeing the faces of customers and employees who were witnessing something they'd probably never see again. True justice. Walking through the door in a business suit and military uniform. Brandon stood with his mouth open, no doubt recalculating everything he thought he knew about the old man who mopped his floors. "There's more," Tommy said. "We've established a foundation in your name, the Marcus Washington Foundation for Children in Need. We've built 12 community centers across the South, providing meals, tutoring, and mentorship for kids who have nowhere else to go. We've helped over 3,000 children in the past 5 years alone. And," Sarah added with a smile that could have powered the whole restaurant, "we'd like you to come with us to Washington. The president would like to meet the man who changed our lives. The ceremony is tomorrow." Marcus looked down at his stained uniform shirt, his worn shoes, his hands that bore the calluses of a lifetime of hard work. I can't." "You can," Sarah said firmly. "You're exactly who you need to be. You're the man who chose kindness when it cost you everything. You're the man who proved that real power isn't about money or position. It's about the courage to do what's right when nobody's watching." As if in a dream, Marcus found himself walking toward the helicopter between these two remarkable people who had once been scared children in his care. The other customers followed them outside, phones raised to record the most extraordinary thing that had ever happened in their small town. Before climbing into the helicopter, Marcus turned back to look at the restaurant, at Brandon, who still stood in the doorway looking stunned, at the people who would go home tonight with a story nobody would believe. He thought about Jake Morrison, wherever he was now, and Mrs. Henderson with her pearls and her prejudices. He thought about his daughter Marie, and wondered if somewhere she was smiling. "Marcus!" Sarah called from inside the helicopter. "Are you ready?" He took one last look at the life he was leaving behind. The mop bucket, the minimum wage, the aching joints, the studio apartment above the laundromat. Then he looked at the two faces waiting for him, no longer children, but still carrying the gratitude of that rainy afternoon when a stranger chose to see them as worthy of love. As the helicopter lifted off, Marcus pressed his face to the window and watched his old world shrink away below. Tomorrow, he would shake hands with the president. Tomorrow, cameras would flash and reporters would tell his story. Tomorrow, the whole country would learn that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is feed two hungry children on a rainy day. But today, sitting between Colonel Tommy and Deputy White House Counsel Sarah, Marcus Washington finally understood what his daughter Marie had meant when she made him promise to help kids who had nobody else. She hadn't been asking him to save the world. She'd been asking him to plant seeds of kindness and trust that someday, somehow, they would grow into something beautiful. Looking at the two successful adults who had once been frightened orphans, Marcus realized that sometimes the smallest acts of love create the biggest miracles. And sometimes, just sometimes, justice comes in a helicopter.